Yes, my friends, Rams fans woke up absolutely thrilled today. The Los Angeles Rams simply steamrolled the New Orleans Saints in their second preseason game, securing a comfortable 34-0 victory at SoFi Stadium. There is plenty to discuss after a performance like that. Of course, preseason results should be viewed with caution, but the way Los Angeles controlled the game from start to finish was impossible to ignore. We need to talk about a few key things Coach Sean McVay will need to tweak for the next game. I'll give you all the details on that in a moment. But first, make sure you smash that like button, but only if you really loved the Rams' win yesterday. If you can, leave a comment saying, "Go Rams!" That's how I like to see it. Man, I was really pleased with the result. The Rams built a 20-0 lead before halftime and didn't let New Orleans pose any real threat, relying on contributions from the offense, the defense, and various players fighting for a roster spot. Most importantly, several young athletes seized the opportunity to prove themselves as the final roster decisions approach. One of the main talking points coming out of this game is undoubtedly the battle for the backup quarterback spot behind Matthew Stafford, as Stetson Bennett delivered a strong response following Ty Simpson's good performance in the first preseason game. Bennett completed 19 of 31 passes for 181 yards and helped the offense move the ball consistently down the field. It wasn't a flawless performance. There were a few passes and decisions he'd probably like to have back, but perfection wasn't the goal here. The Rams needed to see if Bennett could take command of the offense, finish drives, and show poise while running the system. He met many of those requirements against the Saints. Bennett was especially effective when Los Angeles got close to the goal line, using his legs to score 2 rushing touchdowns. He finished with only 9 rushing yards, so this was not about putting up huge numbers as a runner, but rather understanding when an opportunity was available and taking advantage of it. On one of those touchdowns, Bennett made an aggressive dive toward the end zone to finish the play, which was a good example of the confidence he played with throughout the afternoon. After a relatively quiet first preseason appearance, this was exactly the type of response the Rams wanted to see from him. That makes the QB2 competition considerably more interesting because Ty Simpson has also given Sean McVay plenty to think about. Simpson did not receive nearly as much work in this game, completing 8 of 12 passes for 73 yards, but there were still encouraging moments in his limited opportunities. One play in particular showed some of the awareness that has made Simpson such an intriguing option, as he recognized contact down the field and gave his receiver an opportunity to draw a defensive pass interference penalty. It was not the type of play that dominates a highlight reel, but it showed the kind of processing and situational awareness coaches want to see from a young quarterback. The decision between Bennett and Simpson may ultimately come down to what the Rams value most from Stafford's backup. Bennett currently looks capable of operating the offense and has the advantage of experience within the organization, while Simpson may have the greater physical upside and long-term potential. That is a good problem for Los Angeles to have, especially because both quarterbacks have now produced encouraging performances during the preseason. There is still time before the Rams have to make their final decision, but Bennett certainly strengthened his argument with what he did against New Orleans. The quarterbacks also benefited from another strong performance by a reserve offensive line that continues to make a good impression. A.J. Arcuri, Bill Murray, Wyatt Bowles, Blake Hance, and Austin Blask handled the majority of the work up front without the Rams needing their regular starters. Los Angeles still managed to establish its running game and finished with 150 rushing yards, which is exactly what coaches want to see when evaluating the depth of an offensive line. Preseason football can become difficult when backup quarterbacks are constantly under pressure or running backs have nowhere to go, but that was not the story for the Rams in this game. Arcuri and Blasky are particularly interesting names as Los Angeles moves closer to its final roster decisions. Neither player entered the summer with a guaranteed place on the 53-man roster, but performances like this can completely change the conversation surrounding the final offensive line spots. The situation involving Justin Dedich could also influence how many linemen the Rams decide to keep and which players survive the final cuts. Having reliable depth up front becomes extremely valuable over a 17-game regular season, and Los Angeles appears to have some difficult decisions ahead. Jarquez Hunter was one of the biggest beneficiaries of that offensive line performance, but he deserves plenty of credit himself for what he did with the opportunities he received. Hunter finished with 68 rushing yards and a touchdown, providing the Rams with another strong option out of the backfield. He ran with urgency and looked like a player who understood exactly what was at stake. After Dean Connors had generated more attention in the previous preseason game, Hunter needed an answer, and he delivered one against the Saints. The running back competition is another area where preseason production can make a major difference, because there simply are not enough roster spots for everyone. Hunter did not need to produce a 150-yard individual performance to make his point. He needed to run decisively, take advantage of his blocking, and show that the offense could trust him when his number was called. He accomplished that while helping the Rams dominate on the ground as a team. It would be difficult to imagine Hunter doing much more to improve his position in the roster battle than what he showed in this game. C.J. Daniels also took a major step forward and may have created an entirely different conversation at wide receiver. The sixth-round rookie was targeted 13 times and turned those opportunities into 8 receptions for 68 yards, becoming one of the most consistently involved players in the passing game. Daniels had been relatively quiet earlier in the preseason, but against New Orleans, he looked much more comfortable finding space and giving his quarterbacks a dependable target. For a player competing in a crowded receiver room, volume like that matters. The Rams do not necessarily need one player to completely take ownership of the WR3 role because they have several different skill sets available. Konata Mumpfield, Xavier Smith, and Jordan Whittington can all be part of the rotation depending on personnel packages and specific situations. Daniels, however, showed that he deserves to be included in that conversation after what he put on tape against the Saints. If Los Angeles wants to rotate its receivers heavily when operating out of 11 personnel, Daniels may have earned himself a legitimate opportunity to see the field. What stood out about Daniels was not simply the final total of 68 yards. 13 targets tell us the quarterbacks were comfortable looking in his direction repeatedly, and 8 catches show that he was capable of turning those opportunities into positive plays. Young receivers often struggle to establish that level of trust early, especially when several players are fighting for the same limited number of snaps. Daniels making himself consistently available was therefore one of the more encouraging offensive developments of the game. As impressive as the offense was, the defense produced some of the afternoon's biggest moments. Los Angeles forced 3 turnovers and repeatedly stopped New Orleans from converting promising possessions into points. The Saints had opportunities to make the game competitive, including possessions that reached scoring territory, but mistakes completely changed the direction of those drives. Nothing represented that better than Alex Cook's enormous defensive touchdown. Cook intercepted Spencer Rattler near the Rams' goal line and returned the ball roughly 100 yards for a pick six, turning what could have been New Orleans points into a Los Angeles touchdown. It was the type of play that can completely swing a game, even if this happened when the Rams were already in control. Cook went from defending his own end zone to celebrating in the opposite one, producing one of the most memorable moments of the entire preseason matchup. For a player trying to convince the coaching staff that he belongs, it is difficult to create a stronger highlight. The reaction from the Rams sideline also said plenty about the moment. Several established defensive players celebrated with Cook after the return, and it was easy to understand why his teammates were so excited. Preseason games are ultimately evaluations, but the players on the field are still competing, and a defensive touchdown of that magnitude can energize an entire sideline. Cook made sure his name would be part of the conversation after the game. Alzillian Hamilton was another defender who continued building momentum. The undrafted free agent out of Fresno State recorded an interception and also got his hands on another pass, continuing a stretch in which he has consistently found ways to be around the football. Undrafted players enter training camp with very little margin for error because draft status offers them no protection when cuts arrive. The best way to change that situation is to create plays coaches cannot ignore. And Hamilton is doing exactly that. His performance becomes even more valuable when considering that he has not simply appeared out of nowhere for one afternoon. Hamilton had already generated positive attention during the preparation period, and the interception against New Orleans gave him another concrete result to add to his resume. Turnovers can sometimes be unpredictable, but repeatedly being in position to affect passes usually reflects something more sustainable. Hamilton is making the Rams think seriously about what he could offer their defensive depth. Wesley Bailey may have made an even stronger statement. Wearing number 47, Bailey seemed to constantly find himself around the football and produce the type of disruptive performance that can move a player significantly closer to a roster spot. He recorded a 10-yard sack and also forced a fumble in the red zone, helping prevent New Orleans from taking advantage of one of its best scoring opportunities. For an edge defender fighting for a place on the team, those are exactly the impact plays that stand out during film review. Bailey's case is especially interesting because the Rams are not only evaluating statistics. Coaches want to know whether a reserve defender can change a possession, contribute on different downs, and provide value when the starters need a break during the regular season. A sack that puts an offense behind schedule and a forced fumble near the goal line are direct answers to those questions. Bailey entered the game fighting for a roster spot and left it looking much harder to cut. The final score should not prevent anyone from acknowledging just how poor the Saints were either. New Orleans committed 3 turnovers, repeatedly put itself in difficult situations, and finished with 12 penalties for 96 yards. Those mistakes made life significantly easier for Los Angeles and helped turn a preseason game into a complete blowout. The Saints were particularly damaging to themselves when they reached scoring territory, where turnovers erased opportunities to finally put points on the board. New Orleans also struggled badly against the Rams' running game and consistently found itself playing behind the chains. That context matters when evaluating a 34-0 preseason victory, because Los Angeles was not facing a polished opponent playing its best football. At the same time, the Rams still had to capitalize on those mistakes, and they did so repeatedly. Bad teams can give you opportunities, but good execution is still required to turn those opportunities into a 34 shutout. The one major concern coming out of the game was the injury situation. Keir Thomas left with what was described during the game as a groin injury, while defensive lineman Desjuan Johnson also exited with a knee issue. That is the part of preseason football every coaching staff wants to avoid, because evaluating the roster means very little if players are lost in games that do not count in the standings. The Rams will now have to evaluate the severity of those injuries as they continue preparing for the regular season. Outside of those concerns, however, this was about as productive a preseason game as Los Angeles could have hoped for. Bennett responded to Simpson's strong opening performance and made the QB2 competition more difficult to settle. Hunter answered the challenge in the running back room. Daniels forced his way deeper into the wide receiver conversation, and reserve offensive linemen showed that the Rams may have more depth than expected. On defense, Cook, Hamilton, and Bailey all created the kind of splash plays that can completely reshape a roster battle. The 34-0 score will eventually be forgotten because preseason wins do not carry into the regular season standings, but individual performances can have consequences that last much longer. This part of the calendar is about discovering which players can be trusted when the games begin to matter, and the Rams received several encouraging answers against New Orleans. Some players strengthened their cases for backup roles, others may have pushed themselves closer to the final 53, and a few suddenly made upcoming cuts considerably more complicated for McVay and his staff. For a second preseason game, Los Angeles could hardly have asked for much more.